microphone isn't. Are you wanting to stand right at the screen like a podium? Or just, I don't know, whatever. Okay. Yeah. Then I was like, I pretty much needed it with that time change and everything.
Okay, just let me know when we're live.
And I'm pretty far west of Chicago. I'm St. Charles. I'm out, so it's a good 4 hours. But then because that's what the date that she sent us on our calendar. I know.
Live, all right. Okay, so we're gonna get started here. Good afternoon. Good morning for those that are on Central Time, Mountain Time, Pacific Time. This is virtual. Did you know that? We are in a hybrid world now, and so we're gonna have a virtual conference going on. And for those of you that are virtual, you're missing out on some great food. You should see and smell the food here. I don't know why you couldn't make here in person, but you know, whatever. You eat your cold cuts, and we're gonna eat some salmon and steak. So it's great to be in Indianapolis, and it's great to see all of you in person. Welcome. Thank you for coming. You know, this is valuable time. So I want to just get to the speakers here. So I'm Jeff Risch. I help lead the Labor and Employment Group along with 25 of my colleagues, and I love labor and employment. And I wouldn't be a lawyer if I didn't do labor and employment law. I feel sorry for those lawyers that don't do labor and employment law. No offense to all the lawyers in the audience, but I love it. I love it. I love helping small businesses, mid-sized businesses, entrepreneurs. You know, you get out in bed and out of bed in the morning, and you just want to help people just do what's right, get out of the way, and grow and create jobs and opportunities. I love it. So with the presentations this afternoon are really centered on, what do you know? Recruiting, retention. Growing your businesses and growing that specifically with talent. So my colleagues, Kelly Hebtalich and Susanna Overholt, that some of you know and will soon listen to here momentarily, they're here today to share their information. I think we're in for a real treat and some insight. If you have a question during the presentation, feel free to speak up. If you're in the room, virtual, we're going to be monitoring the chat function in the virtual chat room. Any questions we cannot respond to in the allotted time, we're going to answer it after the program. Speaking of which, you will all receive an email following the program. It'll be a thank you email. Check your spam folders for it, but it will allow us to present you with the slides by email, and it will include the answers to some of the questions that we might not get to here today. So with that, Ms. Overholt.
Thank you, Mr. Risch, for being so formal. It is so great. I got to tell you, I have given more presentations in the past 2 years than I think I've given in my entire life, but none of them have had anything other than my office wall standing in front of me. So I got to say, this is great. Of course, the problem is now I'm going to have to see your faces and see whether you actually care about what I'm saying. So, because I entertain myself a lot, but not necessarily everyone else. And it occurred to me, so they told us it's the down arrow to advance the slide, but if you've turned the clicker around, so we're about to have an experiment, because I don't know which was the upward. Let's see. That was the wrong way. Oh, but that means if you press up this direction, okay. See, I figured out. See, now I can go up, which is more intuitive, but I guess I'm holding the clicker upside down for those of you who are going to follow in my footsteps. Anyway, Kelly and I are going to start talking about recruiting and retention issues, which I know is what a lot of people are having issues with, right? Because apparently the pandemic has caused people to think that working isn't as critical anymore, but all of us who employ people think, well, we actually still need people to work for us. And so how in the world do we deal with that? So we're going to try to address that today. So to kind of frame the issue, and we're okay, and we've got two clickers going too. This is the high-tech way of doing this, which is a little complicated. And because we're attorneys, we don't necessarily always deal well with the technical stuff. Anyway, so current labor shortage. What? Is there one? Surprise, surprise. Yes, I know you all have heard that. So SHRM, to put this, we like to frame things. I do labor and employment work and healthcare work. I often talk about fraud-related things for healthcare clients, and I say that I like to frame things by scaring people first, and so this is our kind of scaring you into the reality of the situation, although you've probably all heard this already. So there was a SHRM study that was released earlier, I think this was in February actually, where about 84% of the organizations reported labor shortage challenges in 2021. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. And in Indiana specifically, and I know we've got a lot of people virtually who are not based in Indiana, but everyone in the room has some connection to Indiana. A lot of you online do too. But for Indiana, we've got a very large issue here. So as of December of 2021, we had the lowest unemployment rate in the nation at just 1.3%, which means oh crap, sorry, okay, sorry. I pressed, and I shouldn't say that online, should I? Sorry, but there's another button that I don't know about. That's why you want to hold the clicker this way. Okay, I got it back. Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry, people online. I'm not meaning to shrink the slide so you can't really see it. Anyway, so Indiana's unemployment rate is 1.3%, which basically means there's no one who isn't working who could be working. I mean, that's what that trends. In fact, that means that more people really who are working than should be able to work. That's such a low rate, if that makes any sense. So the national rate is 3.7%. Elkhart Goshen, which I think is really interesting because I know a couple of years ago they had an appallingly high unemployment rate, and now they have the lowest in the nation at 0.9%. And then you've got Bloomington, Columbus, second lowest rate at 1%. I mean, these numbers are just amazing to me. I don't understand them. And then where we sit right now, the Indianapolis, Carmel, Anderson metro area had the lowest rate. That's a metro area with at least 1 million people, had the lowest rate in the nation at 1.2%. So in other words, if you're trying to hire people, you're going to have to convince them to get off their couches and come work for you, or leave their cush jobs their jobs that they have chosen to be in and come work for you, because they really aren't looking to switch. They aren't looking to work because they're all working. Okay, now I'm going to try to do this without messing anything up. I'm sorry. Okay, so the Great Resignation, the other, the term that has come out of the pandemic. So the Department of Labor is saying that there are 3.95 million workers who left their jobs each month in 2021. So about 4 million people leaving their jobs each month in 2021. That's more than has ever been recorded. I mean, it's astonishing. So that's a monthly quit rate of about 3% of the workforce. But it is worse in certain sectors. And I think this part isn't very surprising because it's what we've been hearing throughout the pandemic, right? So leisure and hospitality, their quit rate was more than 6% in several months. Retail is averaging about 5% for its quit rate. Healthcare, a lot of clients who I represent on a daily basis, is averaging just under 3%, which is actually surprising to me. I thought they'd be higher than that. Manufacturing is around 2.5%. And financial activities around 1.5%. So I guess the financial sector, their employees must like working there. So I know we've got a lot of people in the financial sector in here. You maybe should share whatever you're doing to keep your folks. So in general, lower wage jobs tend to have the highest turnover. And younger workers are more likely to quit than older workers. Okay, so that's the world that we seem to be living in right now. So we're going to talk about some things that may impact your ability to keep who you got, because that's what everyone wants to do now. Keep who you got. I guess that might mean making the people who you've got better in case you're having some issues with them. And then how do you get new people to join you if that's what you need to do, okay? Remote work options is something we're going to be talking about. Deb Mastrian's going to talk about that in a little bit. We're going to talk about those lovely additional economic factors, you know, the signing and retention bonuses, perfect attendance bonuses, gifts and prize drawings, you know, things that have come up this year, the kind of little extras that, you know, might entice folks to stay, or, you know, also, whoever would have thought you'd be doing raffles to try to encourage people to get vaccinated, right? I mean, that's what, I had never, ever researched raffle law until it came to, what can I do to incentivize people to get vaccinated? I thought, oh my gosh, you gotta be kidding me. You gotta be kidding me. And we actually called the lottery commission, or whatever it is here in Indiana. There's someone in charge of that kind of stuff. And we said, are you really gonna care? Like, if an employer is trying to incentivize people to get, you know, to get vaccinated and decide to do a raffle or a prize or something, are you really going to care about that? And, like, do they have to follow all these rules? And they said, you know what? No. In the midst of the pandemic, no. If you got to do that to have people get vaccinated, that's okay. So, anyway, there's more. There are other types of prize drawings, though. Deferred compensation, we'll talk about that. Flexible schedules. We're also going to talk about non-compete agreements, and also non-competes in the context of healthcare, because there have been some adjustments here in Indiana on that. Background checks, revisions to drug and alcohol policies, and then other employee benefit programs. So that's a lot. So we're going to get going on that, and I'm going to turn it over to Kelly so she can take us away. Hold this very carefully this way. Don't touch any of these things on the side, and that is the button to advance.
Down, so we're, okay.
Yes, okay, so just...
Thank you.
I don't think it'll explode, but
All right. This little star
now I
button.
gotta figure out my arrows.
It's
Okay.
all very fancy.
Yeah.
All right. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is bonuses. So we've got signing bonuses, retention bonuses, referral bonuses, and perfect attendance bonuses. So one way that employers are using to keep people, attract people, is just by handing out more money where they can. These can be effective, but there can be considerable potential wage and hour issues, primarily involving overtime calculations and whether or not these bonuses need to be included in overtime, as well as wage payment obligations. Depending on the state you're in, there can be situations where an employer might have an obligation to pay a pro rata bonus, and we'll talk about that. So when you're thinking about whether or not a bonus needs to be included in overtime for a non-exempt employee, essentially if the bonus is a gift, then it does not need to be included in the regular rate of pay, and you don't have to do any additional overtime calculation. And what that means as a gift is the employee cannot have a contractual obligation to the bonus and can't have a kind of reasonable expectation. So it generally, examples are things that kind of come out of nowhere. A spot bonus all of a sudden just came out of the blue. That wouldn't be considered in overtime. Things like severance bonuses and so forth aren't. But if it's anything like if you stay, or if you do this, or if you work a certain number of hours, then it does bring up some potential overtime issues. And we'll talk about how you do that in a little bit. If you pay a bonus that has to be included in the regular rate of pay as a percentage of pay, it can be it removes some of the complexity of having to go back and recalculate overtime pay because it's already built in there. So say, for example, you're going to say, we're going to pay you 10% of your earnings if you stay between April 1st and November 1st, November 30th. Then when you pay that 10%, the overtime that they worked is already built in there. So if you were doing a flat dollar amount, you'd have to go back and do calculations to include that in their prior overtime. So that's one way to not get around the overtime rules, but to remove some of the complexity that can make it a real pain. But as soon as a condition is placed on the payout, something like, and I pretty much went over this, but if they have to be employed at the time the payment's made, if it's not just a purely discretionary gift, then it does implicate the overtime rules. And when it becomes part of the regular rate of wages, if overtime is worked during the period that the bonus covers, then that's when you have to go back and make sure that you're including that amount in your overtime calculation. Let's see. Another thing to be concerned about or be aware of is that in certain states, if you have a bonus tied to employment at the time of payment or tied to certain length of service, some states have laws that will require an employer to pay out a pro rata portion of that bonus in certain situations. So, and regardless of whatever kind of language you use in your policy or offer letter or agreement, that's not going to supersede the state law. So some examples are California and Illinois. In certain situations, if say for example, you have a retention payment that if the employee stays for 10 months, he or she gets $1,000. If the employee is terminated by the employer without cause, 6 months in California, they would be entitled to 6/10 of that payment. So you want to be careful that. Now, if the employee up and voluntarily resigned, generally they're not entitled to the payment, but you want to look closely at the state laws because it varies by state, and this is becoming somewhat more common in my opinion. Also, bonuses or other pay programs with a clawback provision of some kind, where you say if you do something, that to violate this or that we can take it back. That doesn't change the analysis here. They sometimes still may have a right to that portion of the payment under that state law. Quick note on referral bonuses. So this is something a lot of employers are looking to do now as they're looking to hire, if they didn't have a program in place before. So this type of bonus, in many circumstances, can be considered a gift and doesn't have to be included in the regular rate of pay for overtime, but it has to be done correctly. So it has to be voluntary, which means it's just on the part of the employee, so that the employee voluntarily refers somebody. And recruiting is not part of the employee's regular job duties, so this doesn't apply to your, HR recruiter or coordinator or somebody, even in another area that has kind of recruiting as part of their job responsibilities. So for your average employee, it needs to be voluntary. It needs to involve minimal time and activity. So that means the recruiting activity, so the time that they're taking. If they're referring somebody that they worked with before or referring somebody that they know, and any kind of recruiting activity takes place after hours or in social settings, then it can be considered a gift and doesn't have to be included in overtime. But if they're doing some type of recruiting activity, during work and it's taken a ton of time, then they've been instructed to, mine their, professional networks, during the day, things like that, then you may end up with a situation where it needs to be included in the regular rate of pay. But generally, and a typical referral bonus program as it's typically designed and paid up front, and I'll talk about that in a minute, would be considered a gift. However, when you have a bonus that is tied to whether the employee stays or not, so longevity of the new employee, so say the program is if an employee refers somebody and we hire them and they stay for a year, then you get $500. That type of bonus would be for a non-exempt employee because there's that condition on it and there's an expectation of payment after that period of time. It would need to be included in the regular rate of pay for overtime. Now, had that $500 been paid right up front and the employee didn't have to stay, then it would not be going into that overtime calculation. So gifts and prize drawings. So like Susanna, I never thought I would be talking about the lottery and gambling and sweepstakes and things like that, but this is like Jeff, I really enjoy employment law, and this is one of the reasons is it's always different. It's never the same thing twice. And so it's been kind of interesting to look into some of this as employees, again, are trying to think of ways to, in addition to incenting employees to get vaccinated, we've had discussions with some clients about incenting employees to stay. Like, can you do a prize drawing?
Kelly, I had a client that gave away $100,000.
Wow.
Didn't really help, but I gave away $100,000.
What was it? Was it if employees stayed, or what was it?
It was a drawing. It was just
like
purely, if you're here, you're around, you stay. We're gonna start prize drawings, and it was like 50,000 and 30,000 and like 20,000.
Huh.
And I think it helped. Like, it was negligible.
Wow.
Yeah,
It's
so.
interesting. Yeah. It's an important takeaway, I think. So, yeah, really. So, but these have unique issues all their own. So, and in some situations can potentially trigger gambling laws and sweepstakes laws. So those can be one and the same, or they can be slightly different depending on your state. Issues from state to state can really be different. Now, if it's a pure gift, the employer is acting 100% through discretion. It can be relatively simple and easy. Now, of course, you need to think about things like disparate treatment or disparate impact, so that if you're doing some type of random drawing or random gift bonus, that you're not favoring one group over another group. And you obviously need to think about income tax issues. Basically anything you're going to give to your employees is going to be taxable. So, and you're going to need to withhold estimated income tax from whether it's cash or whether it's some type of property. You're going to have to do that. So I often get asked, like, what's a de minimis amount or a small amount, and there is no such thing under this part of the Internal Revenue Code. So you need to be thinking about your withholding obligations and then the employee's tax obligations in any type of prize or drawing. So we have some sample policies here that kind of help lay out with a little more specificity how these programs might work and what you need to do when you're setting up a program to stay out of trouble. So clearly, as with any policy, you won't need it to be really specific, and that's really going to benefit you from potential challenges and issues down the road. It's going to need to define who's eligible, any applicable time period. Here in this policy, we talk about full-time hourly non-exempt employees are eligible. We would name the facility. I didn't make one up here, but say it's the Indianapolis facility. The time period and any specific departments, if you're going to limit it to departments. Be clear about who's not eligible. So you're going to exclude managers, HR, other types of employees. You want to be really clear about that. And you can set something up like this up by department. If you're having particular departments that you're having more retention issues with, you can set it up by job level. So you exclude managers, only include this certain level of employees. So those types of characteristics are fine to group employees. And in this example, so for this policy, we were doing 3 things. So we had an hourly rate increase. Do you want to go? Yeah, just go back one really quick. So this employer was doing an hourly rate increase. They basically said everybody else is going to get between 50 cents and $1.50 an hour more. And I don't know if this was for an ongoing basis or for a temporary period of time, but that's one way. I mean, that's if you want to keep employees, sort of increasing basic pay is potentially a first place to consider. Okay. Then they also did a weekly perfect attendance bonus. And in this policy, this is another way that you can not get around paying overtime on the bonus, but avoid some of the headaches. So this is a weekly perfect attendance bonus. So if the employee worked, if they showed up for work each day, each scheduled work day of their week, completed their shift, they would earn $100 for that week. And it's paid within 30 days from the end of the work week. Because they know that the employee has earned it at the time, it can be figured into if that employee works overtime, then you know that you need to include this $100, and then they're paid the overtime correctly, for that, right at the time they're paid for that work week. So it avoids the hassle of having to go back and recalculate and pay overtime later in the year, which is a problem with some bonuses that occur later in the year or at the end of a period of time. Okay? And we did a retention bonus here as well. So pretty standard. It was anybody who's here on, March 4th. So tomorrow. If you're here tomorrow and you're still here December 31st, you're going to get 10% of whatever you earn. So, and that would also be subject to overtime, but by doing 1%, it's already baked in. So when you pay that 10%, you'll be covering the overtime obligation. Let's see. And then this is an example of a prize drawing that this employer looked into doing. So basically talked about same thing if you're here, if you've been employed, if you're here on April 1st and then you're still here in January and you've been continuously employed, you'll have a chance to win one of these 3 potential prize amounts. Okay. And then we've got, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the more specific detail about the policies, but this just gives you an example of the types of things that you want to make sure are in the policy. This is pretty similar to what we looked at, but what I want to show here is, so these are some examples with the retention bonus where, depending on the state law, the employer may have to pay out a portion of that bonus. So if the employee's employment is terminated by mutual consent of the employee and the company, or by the company without cause, then the employee would earn a pro rata portion of the bonus. And again, certain state laws require that be paid. And then this is an interesting example of a sweepstakes. And in this situation, you want to have again, very detailed information on how it works, who's eligible, who's not eligible. Entries in the sweepstakes are automatic. One of the ways that you avoid implicating gambling laws is, so in most states, gambling, so again, all states are different, so you'll need to look up whatever state you're looking at for their gambling laws, but gambling generally you need to have 3 things to have gambling, and it's consideration, chance, and a prize. So the person has to be giving consideration, then there has to be some sort of chance that cannot be eliminated by skill, and then a prize. So you don't want to you can't have your employees pay to enter the drawing. I don't think that would defeat the purpose of sort of doing this in this situation, but it's an important thing to keep in mind. That you don't want them to buy a raffle ticket for $1 or something like that, because you could potentially be implicating the gambling laws. So in this scenario, there's no consideration. That's very clear in the policy later on. Somewhere in here, it talks about how nobody. I'm sorry, I'm making it hard for you because I'm like trying to find it as I'm going back and forth and back and forth. But talk about employees not required to pay, employee cannot pay to get another entry into this, and be very clear. It talks about decisions being binding. It talks about that whoever wins, if you're going to release information, you want to make sure that you have rules on in the policy that the employee is agreeing for their name to be released, and how disputes will be handled, and all of that will just help you in the event you have a challenge down the road. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I would add that this is more for the people that don't win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And protecting the company from all sorts of different allegations, whether it's gambling laws or a inherent unfairness or perceived unfairness on the implementation of the drawing. This is the cover your butt type of policy and rule that you're going to want to have in place.
Yeah. That's what most of this is about, right? Is covering your butt and this sort of thing. And so there's some specific, language sometimes that may need to be included under state sweepstakes laws. So you'll want to make sure about that, and certainly try to limit your liability where you can, and things like that. All right. So that's it on the sweepstakes, gambling, and lotteries. which have been interesting. Another potential thing that employers are considering is some type of deferred compensation. And a retention bonus is a kind of deferred compensation. But we usually hear that term used to talk about compensation at higher levels, and when we're talking about periods that span multiple tax years. So if you're going to try to keep your high-level employees, you may want to, generally I should say, you're going to need to spend a bit more money that's more impactful to employees that are paid higher, and you may want to then have a longer retention period of time. And so if an employee is executive, will receive $20,000 if he or she is employed through the end of December 2024. So that would be subject to IRS deferred compensation rules, because it's compensation kind of earned in one tax year but not payable until another. And the IRS has really strict rules on deferred compensation. So generally its arrangements need to be in writing. That can be an individual agreement, a policy, or plan document. And payment date, form of payment, and payment timing needs to be specified in advance and cannot be changed. So sometimes I see employers trip up on this when they draft a program like that, and they say, we want employees, if you're here on that date, and you'll get X amount of money, and we're going to pay it out within 30 days. And then they get to the end of that time period, and they want to make a bunch of changes. And in some scenarios, you can make changes because I'm not going to get into too much detail, because I could do a whole day on the IRS rules on deferred compensation, but there are times where you can't make changes. It depends on how the program is set up and how specific it was and how much time has gone by and whether that deferred compensation whether it has crossed over into something that they might earn into something that is technically deferred compensation under the IRS rules. So it's something to be cognizant of, and just make sure that those issues are considered when you have a longer term program that spans multiple years. And I'm going to turn it back to Susanna now, who's going to talk about flexible schedules. Keep it pointing.
Yes,
Keep it pointing up.
I'll give you your water back. Okay, got it.
All right, so of course, I think something we've all learned is that after people worked at home for a while, they're thinking, oh, wow, I kind of like this. Do I really have to come back into the office? Can I work less than full time? Because I think I did my job perfectly well from home in my jammies 10 hours a week. So it's, come on, surely, people are hearing that, right? So flexible schedules have become a big deal. I mean, this isn't anything new, right? I mean, people have been trying to do this for years, but it's gotten a little more, there's a little more pressure to allow it these days, especially when you're trying to entice these people who rather be at home on their couches in their jammies than coming to your office, or even working for you from their home and on their couch in their jammies. And no, I didn't really do that. Anyway, so the key is to implement a formal policy that's got clear expectations, so you need to consider core hours. For example, everybody works from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., but so that everyone's, definitely working those 4 hours, and then there's more flexibility in terms of the number of hours you work earlier or later, so are you doing 7 to 2, or are you doing, 10 to 5 or something like that, but just have a set, so you've got this set expectation that everyone's going to be online or engaged for those 4 overlapping hours. And then be clear, as presumably you're all HR folks or have some interest in HR, so that it's that anything can be changed at any time for any reason, right? So be clear that these arrangements can be changed, or that they can be terminated if business needs aren't being met. So if it really is that someone's supposed to be working 30 hours from home in their pajamas and they're only working 10, and they're, that you make it clear what they're supposed to be doing. And the job requirements might change, or if they're not performing. Again, they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So just make that all clear, as you would with all of your other very nicely, well-written, clear policies that I know you all must have. And you need to monitor it closely. Now, that's a little bit harder to do, Because how do you know that they aren't sitting on their couch and their jammies watching, I was going to say soap operas, people don't do that anymore, reality TV, right? Yeah, the Kardashians. Oh, that's my stepdaughter who's been watching the Kardashians for a very long time, a lot the past 2 years. So figure out a way to monitor it. And that's going to depend on that, is that because the person is supposed to be generating a lot of reports, and so you can tell whether they're doing their reports, is it that they are, they're responding to email, they're picking up phone calls, or, you got to figure, because it is hard, because you can't have, I've seen in the movies supposedly that you can like watch through the camera on the computer supposedly, but that's illegal. You can't really do that legally, so that's not going to work. So anyway, and then be mindful of any laws that might be developing or mandates about scheduling restrictions. So you can try to do all this stuff, but again, you got to do it legally and figure out a way to make it work for you and your staff. So the other thing that I was going to talk about is, I just want to make sure I have my little cheat sheet about what I'm supposed to be talking about. So restrictive covenant arrangements, that's another thing that in the past, I would say, Mr. Josie, yes, a question from the Peanut Gallery.
Yeah, on your flexible schedules and monitoring, how do you monitor to avoid overtime claims? Because people say, well, I'm on 24/7, or you gotta get it down.
So the question is, how do you monitor for overtime claims, to monitor whether someone is working the additional hours they say they're working or not working the additional hours? I think that, well, I mean, again, it's always, everyone should have the clear written policy. You aren't allowed to work overtime unless it's authorized, but that doesn't really save you, because if you're allowing it to happen, that's a problem. I guess, but so with that monitoring, I mean, that's the thing, I'm not this might be something to look into, depending on what the employee's job is. If there's really no reason for them to be in your system after 5 o'clock, and your IT person would probably say this is going to be too much of a pain, but do you cut them off out of the system after 5 o'clock? Or is it that you regularly go in and audit to see when they're accessing the system, and you realize that they are doing stuff after 5 p.m. and you talk to them about it? They're not authorized, you observe it, you talk to them, but then you do have to keep monitoring. It is going to be more work. So if there's a big concern about overtime, then having someone work remotely or have this flexible schedule of sorts, I think that's something you've got to take into consideration in determining whether that's something you can even allow, So how's that for a non-answer? Yeah.
Well, and if you have a policy that says overtime must be approved in advance, and you have somebody who is routinely, not doing that, and they can't support why they've got extra work and they're not getting it approved, you have to pay the overtime, but then you can take disciplinary measures against that employee for not following the policy,
Right.
up to and including getting rid of the employee if you have to. So
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always like also getting the attestation of some sort, reporting.
Yeah.
If they're exempt, they're exempt. Nobody cares
Right,
about
right,
the
but
exempt worker.
right.
But the non-exempt worker,
Sorry.
I know.
the non-exempt worker is protected. So we've got to make sure that they're reporting, and when they report it, just have them, the little legalese on the bottom that I attest this is accurate, this is all the hours, so they're not changing their story down the road, because they always change the story down the road in the complaint, and then when we take their deposition, it's even more hours.
Better.
It's more hours. Then
Right.
it just keeps increasing.
Right, so
Yeah.
be really clear about the policy in the beginning and then consistently enforce it.
Yeah.
Right, just like most everything else that we're gonna talk about today. Be
Yeah.
really clear
Yeah.
with the policy and then consistently enforce it.
Right. It's not. I like to talk to people about. It's not good enough to have. You have your nice employee handbook, and you spend all this time, creating this lovely employee handbook, and whether it's a real thing now a hard copy sitting on a shelf, or you've just got the PDF online or whatever. All this time doing it, and you have all the employees. They start and they sign their acknowledgement, and then you say, okay, fine. Well, but you've got to then, implement. So you adopt the policies, you implement them, and then you've got to follow through and enforce the policies. So that's, it's, you all have been to enough of these presentations. We say that all the time, but that's the core issue with all of these things too. All right, so restrictive covenants, they were something that, have been really popular to try to, and I guess people still like to use them, try to prevent, well, gosh, I'll keep my employees from going somewhere else. I'll make them sign a restrictive covenant, a non-compete agreement. Or it might be non-disclosure agreement. That's the thing. Well, someone's coming to work for me. That's just make sure I don't want them telling my secrets, telling my business to anyone else. And non-solicitation clauses. The other thing, I don't want someone who leaves my employment to go somewhere else and then tries to get all my other employees and customers to go to that new employer. So those are the three different types of restrictive covenants you often find that people try to incorporate into employment agreements somehow. And one of the things that if you've chosen to go that route, you've got to you want to make sure they're enforceable. And Indiana is different from some states. I'm going to talk about specific rules that were adopted for physicians. But the courts in Indiana, it's generally, they look at the geographic scope, the duration, but also look at the employee's job. So the thing is that it's not, so the way to retain your employees, you may say, I'll retain my employees by having every single one of them sign, non-compete or some sort of restrictive covenant, if you will. But if it's a cashier at your big box store, for example, having that kind of person sign a non-compete is going to be considered unreasonable because, what's the big deal if you're a cashier at, and I'm trying not to, at big box A, that way on 86th Street, and you want to go be the cashier at big box B that way on 86th Street here in Indianapolis, Indiana. For those of you who don't know what 86th Street is, it's lined with all these national chains. It's not going to be enforceable most likely. So you got to be careful, The thing is, too, that again, Indiana's a little bit different because we kind of, in terms of, general laws regarding the employment situation, our state doesn't adopt very many of them. But the Biden administration is actually, looking at restrictive covenant agreements and kind of how they wanted the Department of Labor and the National Labor Relations Board and all those entities, what they're going to do with them. So it's just something that we will be keeping our eye on and keep you posted. And I'm going to talk about the physician ones in a little minute, the physician statute. So background checks are another thing that, I guess the takeaway for non-competes and restricted covenants, again, is that it's this two-edged sword. The point of having this in here is that you may think it's a way to keep people. It may see something that an employee may be upset about it. A potential employee say, well, I don't want to sign all this. Why should I work for you? So thinking about that, and then thinking about, am I really using it to keep people where it's going to be enforceable, and it's a valid agreement, or am I being overbroad in it? So it's one of those tools that needs to be, I would say, tread with caution when trying to use them. So the background checks, so I know from looking at the entities that a lot of you, we got a list of, who's coming and where you work and stuff. So I know a lot of you are in, industries where you got to do background checks on your employees, or whether you need to, it's a wise idea to do that. But it's one of those things where you can go overboard. When regulations require it and the nature of the employee's job requires it, yes, do the background check that's related to the requirements of the position, but if you go overboard and say, well, I'm going to do them for everyone, again, you might be carving out, losing some talent that you might want to attract when you're doing a background check when it doesn't really matter. You might be screening out folks for things that show up in their background that don't have any bearing on their job. So it's time to kind of rethink. If you aren't subject to, some people are subject to federal regulations, state regulations, to make it very clear that, if you're convicted of certain types of crimes, no, you cannot hold this type of position. Okay, you got to follow that. But there are others where it's not, it's a gray area, or it's just a thought, oh, well, wouldn't it be good to do a background check? Well, if you're having trouble recruiting and retaining folks, and this is more of a recruitment thing, I guess, just kind of think about it. Do we really need it? What's our real concern? what are we looking for? And then there are obviously different types of background checks. You know, you're doing a criminal one, credit history, education. I mean, so education references, past employer references. I mean, those are, you know, kind of standard things. The things, though, that you need to think about are the criminal, the credit history, because there are regulations that apply to those. Again, what you can use them for and the disclosures that you have to give to the employee, the applicant, and how you're going to use them. And it's a question of, again, looking at what you've got in place now. Should you suspend your background checks because you're having problems recruiting people? Are you able to do that with the industry you're in? Should you eliminate background checks, certain categories of them, because of the industry you're in, the type of people you're wanting to hire? You know, in other words, does it really matter? I would say that you know, want to look at least a little bit into who you're hiring, but it's, you know, it's something, look at it critically, because I used to have a sign in my office that said, you know, so, you know, because we used to always do it this way, for, you know, and then with a big line through it, you know, and this is a situation where it's, you know, yeah, we've done these we've done these background checks because we've always done it this way. But this is the time, and it's always good. I mean, you know, and I also had the thing, you know, think outside the box. I mean, people would get upset when they came to my office because I'd point to various signs. It's like, what are you? Anyway, also, lack of planning on your part is not an emergency on my part. That was a really big one. That was right behind my head, I would say. Excuse me. Anyway, some people work with me now are like, well, you're a little hypocritical there. Anyway, so... Anyway, but really, this is the time. I mean, actually, we should have labeled this, you know, that it's not just because we've always done it that way with a line through it, because it is time to rethink, why do we do this? We've been doing these same background checks as long, you know, I started as the HR director here, and we were doing them before, and they were just fine. Why not keep doing them? Well, a pandemic intervened, and the world, unfortunately, seems to have changed a bit, so it's time to look at that. And of course, I get ahead of myself and don't know what I'm supposed to be saying, so we've already talked about this. Yeah, but except the caveat, again, is that you need to know who you're hiring, you know, so I mean, I would, you know, even though we talk about, well, you might rethink the types of background checks you're doing, I would never say just bring in people off the street and don't do any kind of background check. I mean, you do need to know, and we've all learned through experience that people lie, right? People are not always who they say they are, or they've not always done what they say they've done, and then, you know, you do your due diligence and you hire them and you bring them in, and the first day of their employment, you finally get the call from that critical person you've been trying to reach and find out the person lied, cheated, and stole, and they're sitting in the office with your CEO, actually in the CEO's house. That at that time, this is a real story, and you got to pick up the phone and call the CEO and say, you know, is he there? Like, well, can you call me? Like, why don't you wrap up your meeting ASAP and give me a call? That happened. I was the person who had to make that phone call, so just, you know, I can share that because you gotta do your due diligence. Sorry, I tried, I really did try. Okay, so the other, drug tests and screening, this is another thing that, you know, weeds people out, right? I mean, the theme here is looking at all these things and saying, because you're probably saying, well, yeah, of course we do these things, every good employer does these things. The reason we're talking about them is because this, again, the context of how do we get those 1.3% of the people in Indiana who have decided they are not working, right? I mean, it's just those numbers. I mean, which means what you're really doing, because those are people who probably just cannot physically work. They've excluded themselves, they've removed themselves from the workforce, you know? So you're talking about people who are in jobs. They're in jobs, getting a paycheck. How do you get them to come work for you, right? So drug tests and screening, again, don't just drop them. Some of you have to do drug tests and screenings because of the industries you're in, because of the types of services you provide, all that type of stuff. But the thing you can look at is, okay, what am I really required to screen for? Is there any room for laxity? Is that a word? Can I be lax, a little more lax in my screenings? And using the tolerance level seems like an odd word to use when we're talking about drugs, illegal drugs, but anyway, can I lower my tolerance for, or increase my level of tolerance for what can be revealed in these test results? You know, and think about alcohol, think about cannabis, you know, and think about too, whether, I mean, I don't know, I've heard, see, this is where I'm totally out of it. We have a whole practice group that deals with cannabis law, by the way, so it is very good stuff to be learning about. But I learned recently about like this Delta 8 stuff or whatever that is like, I don't know, but it's, and it's an interesting question because it's cannabis. Many people are laughing at me, sorry. This is why it's not good to have a live audience, I guess. But but anyway, yes, and I'm showing my age, but, you know, so cannabis is not legal in Indiana, but certain CBD stuff is, and and so make sure you understand that if you're testing someone for marijuana, if they're using any of these CBD products or this Delta 8 stuff, whatever it is, you know, is that going to show up as a positive drug screen? And make sure you know how that shows up, because that's not necessarily illegal, right? I mean, so it's thinking about that. So just making sure your lab, I mean, you as an employer shouldn't necessarily have to be able to read these toxicology reports, you know, but making sure your lab is screening for the right stuff, you know, and figuring out what are the things that you ought to be screening for, and don't worry about the stuff you have to screen for. Again, it all is looking at your current practice, looking at your current policies, and figuring out if there's something you can modify that might make it so that you're able to recruit more, that you aren't screening out, you know, a bunch of your applicants. I mean, I know that we had heard before the pandemic, I mean, some of the manufacturers were having huge issues recruiting workers, and so they adjusted. They said, well, okay, you know what, if our employees are smoking pot on the weekends, whatever, as long as they're okay when they come to the workplace. And well, then you got to figure out, because pot stays in the system, how are you going to test for that? But it's kind of, again, making those adjustments, figuring out what's acceptable, permissible in your workplace, and acting accordingly. You know, the thing is safety sensitive positions, so you got to think about who are, you know, the forklift driver, you know, forklift driver tests positive for marijuana on a Monday morning. Maybe don't want them driving the forklift that Monday, right? You know, so it's just something, you know, it's just thinking about those issues. And if, again, as we said, if they're self-imposed requirements, modifying them. Yes.
I'll go through these pretty
Yeah.
quickly and turn
Yes,
it back
there
over to
is.
you. I think we are trying to stay on time. So, again, there are some employee benefit things that you might want to consider if you're looking to recruit, retain new employees. Things that you may have not thought about before. Some of those are voluntary benefits. So this is stuff like programs that are generally the employer does not contribute to the cost, but it's something that it may just make it easier for your employees to sort of purchase something through payroll deductions. Examples include additional types of insurance. We've seen critical illness insurance, accident insurance, hospital indemnity insurance. So it's separate from your medical plan. And generally, if you do these correct, they're not subject to ERISA if they're entirely employee paid. It's just the benefit to the employee is that they, you know, it's difficult to go out and get critical illness insurance on your own. I mean, I guess you probably can. I've never really looked into it, but it would never occur to me. But I, you know, jumped on when the company was doing it because it was, and it's through payroll and easy to do. Other things are ID theft protection. I've seen pet insurance through this. Things like, there's a bunch of different companies, but some of the regular insurance companies will have like a suite of things that you can do. And if you get employees kind of invested in some of that, that's just another thing that they're going to need to think about if they're thinking about leaving. Benefits for part-time employees. So historically, you know, part-time employees have often been excluded from being able to receive traditional benefits. But if you are needing to supplement your workforce, and one way is potentially bringing on part-time employees. I get a lot of questions frequently about, well, can I give benefits to part-time employees? And you absolutely can, and the ways to do that are prorated vacations and paid holidays. So, I mean, if you have somebody who works 3 days a week, why not give them 3/5 of the vacation holidays that a full-time employee gets? Other things, you can certainly lower your threshold for health insurance. I see that less commonly because that's, you can't really prorate that, but it's certainly something you can do. Another thing to think about is that the law changed a couple years ago for 401k plans, that you're going to, if you have a 401k plan, you're going to need to be including part-time employees within the next couple of years. So, certain part-time employees. So the way the law works is that for part-time employees that work 500 hours a year for 3 consecutive years in a row, you're going to have to allow them into your 401k plan. And that started the beginning of this year, but they wouldn't, so they have to work 500 hours in 22, 23, and 24. So it's coming, but so is that something you want to adopt earlier? You want to make it attractive. Do you want to have part-time employees in your 401k plan? Something to think about. Other employee benefits, to consider a non-traditional, unlimited PTO potentially. That works well in certain industries with certain types of employees, often exempt employees who have to do their job no matter how many. It's not really unlimited PTO because you can't get your job done. But, and it wouldn't work necessarily for other positions where they're not, they can't work if they're not there and things like that. So, but it's something to consider if it works for your workforce. Employee well-being and family-focused benefits is something I hear a lot of talk about now. We're going to take just a couple more minutes. I know we just got the hook to come off, so I'll finish up quickly. No. The last couple of years with COVID has really highlighted things like a need for backup childcare. There are folks that have, fortunately, I haven't had to deal with childcare recently. I've aged out of that, thank goodness. I've been so thankful for that over the pandemic. I don't envy, people that have had to deal with that in the past couple of years, and the need for things like backup childcare. If your, provider isn't available, do you have a contract with somebody where somebody can drop off their kid, and again, certain types of workforces that's going to, maybe work for if you have a large number of people in one place, and so you can you can vet a child care provider, things like that. Child care referral services, or child care expense subsidies. So creative ideas, child care has really been a big issue we've been hearing a lot about. And then just overall well-being, mental health, benefits, EAPs if you don't have them, mindfulness benefits, things that just help support employees as they're getting through this, and financial well-being initiatives. We've heard a lot of talk about that as well. Other considerations when attracting new employees, we've seen greater use of virtual interviews and job fairs, but you really have to train your managers on how to do that and how to do it correctly without getting into trouble. You can be more creative in negotiating your compensation packages. These days, things like phased-in salary increases. So maybe you're not willing to agree to a certain salary, but consider doing things that are not what you've always been doing. Like Susanna said, this is the time to do that. But then if you're, it's critical to consider your current staff. If you're finding yourself hiring new staff in at higher wage rates, you got to be thinking about what you're going to do for your current staff to avoid any potential, disparate impact issues, but also, you don't want them all bolting for the door either. Okay. This I'm not going to go through. This is just a list of kind of creative ideas that might be good or bad, or that we, I certainly have some opinions on some of these, but they're things that people talk about. So. And then all the stuff that we've talked about here, it's really important to remember that if you have a unionized workforce or employees under a collective bargaining agreement, you'll likely need to bargain with the union, because these would typically trigger mandatory bargaining obligations. Now, if you're giving away more money or giving another benefit, there's not likely to be a problem, but you definitely have to involve the union or you could run into trouble. And then this I'm not going to spend much time on. I think we're seeing less of an issue related to refusal of work issues as pandemic kind of mandates have gone away. Because we were seeing this when somebody, in the beginning, when certain employees may have said, I don't feel safe coming back to work. That is less of a valid argument nowadays. But that doesn't mean that if things change and things ramp up again that we won't see this. So I'll leave you to take a look at that slide. And then, Susanna, you have a couple of slides on healthcare that you want to talk through?
Just
and then
really,
we'll hand it off.
just really quickly, because I know, there are some health care people in the room, there's some online. Just the thing, but it's good for everyone to know this, that the thing that we say in the healthcare world is that whatever is a legally permissible thing to do in the regular business sector and might be considered part of a normal, perfectly acceptable thing to do in recruiting, retaining employees may possibly be illegal if it's in the healthcare arena. So it's just that, something to think about. It's just that if you do bonuses in healthcare, remember, it can't be based on referrals in any way. Physicians have very specific rules if they're, governed by Medicare. If Medicare reimbursements, they've got to be the ones providing the services. I mean, they're just very specific rules. And under some new rules acted within the past few years, laboratory employees and independent contractors can't be paid commissions or bonuses based on referrals. So that's just, all these things are something to keep in mind if you're in the healthcare industry. The other thing I had said, I touched upon briefly before, physicians in Indiana, there are new non-compete requirements for physicians. So again, if you're an employer of physicians, just be aware of the new statute. And it's that their non-competes have to have some very specific information in them. So I won't go through that. It's in the slides for people who find themselves in that situation. There are a few slides here on that. A lot of slides on here anyway. But, and our lovely, good, our pictures didn't show. No, you don't have to go to, you didn't have to do that. Anyway, so that's our presentation. We're going to move on to Deb Mastrian and Suzanne Newcomb. Or Deb Master, is it?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Deb.
Deb's gonna
Yes, sorry.
talk about teleworking.
Yeah, I'll come up there and be here.
Yeah. So, are you using this? So that's the arrow to advance. And don't touch those side buttons.
Move it forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like normal.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Good job, guys.
I'm gonna, before I talk to you about teleworking, which obviously is an issue everybody's had to deal with this last 2 years, and it's going to be ongoing. I just want to follow up on one thing that Susanna was talking about, and that's restrictive covenants, at least in Indiana, because it's something that I continue to see right now. One type of very common restriction is the non-solicitation of employees. So you'll typically have a provision in your agreement that is, if you're terminated, you won't go out and solicit any of our employees when you leave. If that provision is in any of your agreements right now, it's invalid. 2 years ago, our courts in Indiana said it has to be limited to employees in whom you have a legitimate protectable interest. So I bring it up not because it was something that was recent or happened this year, 2 years ago when that change was made, but I continue to see those agreements that clients have forwarded to us. So if you haven't, review your restrictive covenant agreements and make sure that that provision is updated. So now I'll talk to you about teleworking, because obviously one of the things we're talking about here today is how to retain and attract talent. And teleworking, has been around as I think companies have tried to work-life balance with the younger generations. It's something that started, but then obviously with the COVID pandemic, there's been a surge in teleworking, and it's prevalent and it's here to stay. I mean, for a lot of companies, if you want to retain and attract, talent. So I was just reading statistics this week on a report that just came out that showed that even though the restrictions have been lifted, most restrictions in many places, the number of teleworking jobs that are being offered is still surging. So it's surging even though the restrictions are going down. So, and I know that there are some companies who allowed teleworking, obviously during the pandemic, for accommodations and to keep businesses going, and now are reverting back and aren't allowing it. And some of them are seeing some struggles in retaining people, and they're losing some good people to that. So, but to answer a question we always get is, do I have to offer it? No, but if it's something you're going to have to continue to consider if you want to retract and retain talent. So first of all, talk about teleworking. Some people will use it interchangeably with remote working. Technically, remote working is where the employee is working in a geographic area outside of where your business is located. So you have a business in Indiana, but you have a remote worker you have someone working in Illinois. That's a remote worker. So again, ultimately, decision is up to the company. You don't have to allow it, but it's something that you'll need to consider if you want to keep your employees. Oh, went the wrong way. Thanks. There are also, understand that teleworking can be temporary arrangement or it can be a permanent arrangement. Temporary, you have an employee who had to quarantine because of COVID, so they're working for 14 days from home. So that's a temporary teleworking situation. Or an extended vacation, went to Florida for 2 weeks, I'm going to stay 2 more weeks and work. Those are temporary, and usually not very many legal issues are raised when you have a temporary situation, and permanent is obviously the more long-term. So again, it's up to the company if you want to allow it, but the one thing, as with everything, if you're not going to allow it for one but allow it for another, make sure you have a legitimate non-discriminatory reason for treating the employees differently. And one of the other things you also have to think about, especially with the temporary situations, is it worth the headache? If you have an employee who is going to go works in Indiana, but they're going to go over to Illinois to take care of their elderly parent for a couple months, do you allow it? If you do, just be aware of the fact that you might have to withhold taxes. You need to check the period of time, 14 days or longer, you need to check, because you may have to register to do business in those states. So I'm going the wrong way again. So pros and cons, obviously, some of the pros with the teleworking are flexible hours, and saves the employee time on their no commuting, no gas, from the employer's perspective, you may not have the overhead, the office space. The studies show that there is increased productivity for the remote workers. That's generally saying, obviously there are situations if there's young kids at home or distractions like that, it may not be. And those are all things that you need to deal with if you're going to allow it in your policy and in a teleworking agreement that you have, so that those things are accounted for. But generally the studies have shown that the workers are more productive at home because they're saving on the commute time. There's less distractions with the office phone ringing or the socialization that goes on in the office. It also gives you the ability to hire people outside of your area, so your geographic area. You're in Indianapolis, but if you're going to have teleworking and it's appropriate for your positions, you can recruit talent in other states or other parts of the states that you might not normally get. Obviously, some of the cons are less collaboration. You're missing out on that mentoring. It's harder to train. It's harder to supervise and manage. And in some cases, you're dealing with, obviously, a different time zones. So those. But as with anything, if you're going to have teleworking and you don't already have one, you need to have policy so that you can clearly set out what your procedures are for it, what the expectations are, who's eligible for it, and let people know, first and foremost, it's not a company-wide benefit. and not everyone's going to be eligible for it. And teleworking, I mean, it's going to work for some industries, and obviously for other industries it's not. I mean, if you're an industry with frontline workers, you know, long-term care industry, hospitals, doctors' offices, I mean, it's not, you're not generally going to have that many positions where teleworking might work. But for other industries like the software and the tech industries and real estate, it can work. But you need to have a policy, set forth all those things, and be very clear that even if you're going to allow it, the company has the discretion to change it and end it at any time. These are just some of the procedures if you're going to have a policy yes, David.
I was just thinking in the healthcare field with telehealth, and this could be applicable in other industries, where the person is located could have an impact on whether they can deliver service. There might be a problem, somebody delivering service from Missouri to Indiana, just because the licensing requirements for that position would say, well, Missouri law applies, you have to be licensed in Missouri. So your business might put restrictions on the licensures or other requirements too.
Yep, and that's a good point. So that's just all the things that you have to consider if you're going to continue to use it or start using it. So again, with setting out your procedures, I mean, have a written request. You know, you don't want your managers out there verbally promising things. Have a process. Determine who's going to make the determination and what are the considerations going to be. And can you consider things like productivity and an employee's attendance? Yes, you can. Now on the attendance issues, obviously, and all you HR people know this, you can't consider approved, you know, leaves of absences in a negative way against an employee. But in general, if they have bad attendance, that can be considered the employee's ability, their experience, any non-discriminatory factors can be taken into consideration whether or not this person's going to be, you know, appropriate for teleworking. And you can have eligibility criteria. You know, you have to have worked for the company for a year before you can telework, you know. So you have an opportunity to train them, you know, mentor them before, you know, they're out teleworking. And it is a good idea to have your teleworkers sign a written agreement. And in your written agreement, you reiterate your processes and your expectations. The other things you got to think about are your schedules, you know, the number of days. You can have hybrid arrangements. Doesn't have to be, you know, the employee is working teleworking every day. You can have 3 days in the office, 2 days at home. It can be anything that you want it to be, but you should set those expectations out so that it's clear. I mean, that's how the arrangement's going to work. Also addressing the manner and frequency of the communication that's expected. And really important, I've had this issue, you know, come up. Even though you agree on a set schedule and you say, here's the days in the office, here's the days at home, here's what your expected hours are, always include that they might be expected to come in the office on days even though they're not, you know, normally scheduled to be there. You could have meetings, trainings, but you want to just make sure that the employees understand that. The other thing you have to think about is equipment needs. You know, if you're going to allow it, what does the employee need at home in order to be effective? You know, what kind of computers, you know, do they, software, photocopiers, printers. Good idea to keep an inventory listing so you know what's the company's property versus the employees, and then who's going to maintain it, the company or the employee, who's responsible for it. Those are all things that are just pretty standard that you include in your teleworking agreement and your policy. And then, again, set those expectations. Expenses. If you have an expense policy, look at it, make sure that it addresses your teleworkers and review and update that. Are you going to reimburse for any of the setup costs, and are you obligated to reimburse for any out-of-pocket costs? In Indiana, that answer is generally no, although a lot of employers do. In other states, Illinois, well, I'll get to that in just a minute, they have some specific statutes on reimbursement of expenses. So just another thing, and I'm going to talk about in just a minute, but you always have to check the laws of the state in which your remote employee is working and comply with those laws as well. So, but federal law in general, you don't have to reimburse unless it takes the non-exempt employee down, below minimum wage. With respect to travel expenses, I would say, most employers are reimbursing for those. Probably just, it's bad for morale if you're going to have a remote worker and say you got to come here for training or you've got to come here for a meeting and then you don't reimburse them for their travel costs. I mean, so that's just, do you have to do it? No, but, well, not in Indiana, but you should, as just a matter of good business. So as I was saying, there are some states, California, Illinois, that require that you reimburse employees for certain expenses. So again, the importance of knowing the state laws where your remote workers are working, because in Illinois you have to reimburse employees for all their necessary business expenses, and that includes a portion of their internet and their cell phone bills. So, and
No, I just had a question. In Indiana, do you, if they go below, if an employee is
If they-
incurring an expense and goes below minimum wage, that's going to be an issue under Indiana minimum wage law?
yes.
Correct.
And-
Well, in Indiana, the federal minimum wage is
Yeah.
the state local wage. So yeah, it definitely becomes a problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's it. And I think that mentioned that early on, but yeah, that's the only caveat.
That's the only
to-
exception in Indiana. Like, Indiana follows federal law, so it's only if it takes you below minimum wage. So that's obviously only applicable to the non-exempt employees. But in Illinois, if you don't have to, you should have an expense reimbursement policy, and if they don't follow your policy, you can discipline them for not following the policy. But, and I think what most employers I've seen do or set an agreed upon monthly amount to cover the portion of their cell phone bill and their home internet bill and any other miscellaneous expenses they're going to have. The other thing to consider are your compliance and security issues. Really important, I know, with our financial institution clients, and our healthcare clients, with the confidentiality of the information that's being dealt with. So you want to review and update your confidentiality and your information security policies and procedure, and make sure that it's addressing the teleworking situations, and add remote access and what the policies and procedures are for there. And include the additional security measures, whatever they are, in your teleworking agreement. Again, and you have them in a policy, but have them in a separate agreement that's signed by the employee so that they understand that just because you're working from home doesn't mean you're exempt from the company's policies. They have to follow all your existing policies and procedures. And even at home, you got to take the safe measures to safeguard the information that you're dealing with. So we put in some of the steps to include locked file cabinets, restricting access, don't print off things that you don't need to print off, and auto lock your computer and cell phones. Kind of some of the similar things you do in the office, but you should continue to do them at home.
Make sure they're not letting all the other family members use the computer that you've issued to them.
Yes, your kids, yes, yeah, exactly. Data privacy, another thing to remember, and some states have specific data privacy laws. California, if you have California remote workers, there are some specific laws that apply that you need to have policies for. But especially virtual private networks, if you're, are something that you should have, especially employees, even not just working from home, you're going to go work from the coffee shop. I mean, if you have a virtual private network, you're going to help protect that information. I've already talked about that, and I'm getting my cutoff sign. These are just some, and you'll have a copy of these slides, additional security measures if you're going to have the remote access that you can include in your policy and reiterate in your employment agreements. But most importantly, these are all the different types of laws that you need to consider if you have remote workers. So the different laws that are implicated: workers' comp, payroll taxes, unemployment, employment posters. In Illinois, you have to put, I just learned this week, actual posters in your handbook. Rest breaks, minimum wage, drug testing, leave, termination, these are all the different in different states. And if so, you have to comply with the laws where your employee is working. Recording of hours worked, really important on teleworking, because you're generally not working, the set schedule. That the non-exempt employees have to record all the hours that they've worked, and you have to pay them for all the hours that they worked. We talked about this a little bit earlier. That's why it's really important to have your pay practices and policies updated. Make sure you have, overtime has to be approved by your manager. Again, you still have to pay them for that time, but you can discipline them for not following your policy. And so just make sure you understand, the teleworkers understand that they're still obligated to report all their hours worked, and that means responding to those calls and those emails, and just have really clear overtime and off-the-clock policies so that the employees know what's expected. And that's it for teleworking.
Yeah, and great. I think a break.
We
Kevin, is
have a 15-minute break, so everybody can go to the bathroom and take a break, and then we're going to come back and talk about employee handbooks and new changes in Indiana law.
I'm ready whenever you are.
And it's also going to let the employees know what you are offering to them. So, I mean, you're telling the employees about their policies they're expected to follow, and attendance and overtime and reporting their hours, and you're telling them what good things you have to offer them, your benefits, your leave policies. So you want to have a handbook. That's generally something different than if you have an operations manual or clinical policies or specific things, for operations. Those should be in a separate place. The employee handbook is more general about the company's general policies that apply to everyone. So, and the employee handbook's important too because it also helps you defend against claims. And it's for companies, it's not a matter of if you're going to have some type of claim. You're going to have a claim, whether it's an unemployment claim or a claim of discrimination. And your handbook's important because that's where your policies are. And if you have good policies, compliant with the laws, and you are uniformly enforcing them, that's your best defense to claims, whether they're unemployment, discrimination, wage and hour. So you want to ensure that your policies are consistent, they're communicated accurately, set out the expectations and show the employees, how they're expected to resolve matters and give warning of here's the types of conduct, they're going to give rise to disciplinary action. But I'll say, one of the other important things for handbooks, and sometimes it's a missed opportunity, is it really should at the beginning of your handbook, before you get into all the policies and procedures, set out the company's mission, a little bit of the company's history, the company's philosophy, the culture, make it attractive to the employees that they feel a part of, something good. I'll also say, too, don't overlook, it's not in these slides, don't overlook a table of contents that's really well organized. I have seen handbooks that just literally there's no subject matter headings, and it's just a series of policies, not even in alphabetical order, and it's really difficult to use. I mean, so pick up that handbook and look at it as if you were the employee. You wanted to go find, a particular policy, could you easily find it? I mean, don't... so organize it in a good way.
Yeah, and I would add to that to think about it from the perspective of a new employee just coming in the door. And I in preparing for this, I was trying to get some statistics about why employees leave, and that's a whole different issue. I think it really depends on how the question's framed. But one of the things that I did see is that a problem that many employers are seeing right now is a new employee will come in and they'll work for a day or two, and they're like, no, I'm not feeling it here, right? I don't feel like this is where I want to be, and I got 3 other places that I think I can get a job by the end of the week. So making sure that those new employees coming in the door have that employee handbook as an asset, I think is a big deal today in particular.
Right, and so that, to Suzanne's point, make it an asset, not a liability. Set a positive tone. Again, set your mission statement and your company philosophy in there, and make that employee feel like they're a valuable asset to your business. Obviously, it should also be workable. It's clear and concise, and effectively convey, the information. And don't forget to regularly update it. And by regularly, I don't mean once every 5 years. Do it, make it an annual process that you review it. And I'll tell you, if you do that, it's really easy to keep up with changes. But if you let it go too long, then it becomes more costly and a much bigger headache. So it's a good process just to have an annual review of your policies. And then if there's any big changes, along the way, you can always make it more regular, but at least annually, because you want to keep up with all the changes in the laws, and don't forget about the remote workers. In terms of Indiana, we are, from an employer perspective, lucky that we are an employer-friendly state, so we don't have very many changes to our laws recently The only one that affects handbooks that happened this year is Indiana adopted a pregnancy accommodations law. Now this is really, and it applies to employers with 15 or more employees. Most other states already had these laws, and there was already a federal Pregnancy Discrimination Act. So a lot of employers already had policies, but if you don't, you should have a separate pregnancy discrimination policy now. That took effect this last July. So it's not enough just to say in your EEO policy, we don't discriminate against, sex. Have a separate pregnancy discrimination policy. The other change in Indiana law that affects employers is if you use minor employees. If you have 5 or more, Indiana has moved to an online registration system now. It's called the Youth Employment System. If anybody ever had to deal with employing minors, they would know what a headache it is in Indiana, because you had to have a permit from the school and a permit from parents, and all this paperwork that was a big headache. So they've eliminated that, and it's all online now. So 5 or more employees, get registered. There's an app. It's supposedly very easy to use. There were also changes that were made to the work hours that you're allowed to use minors. So if you do use minors, you'll just want to get updated on what those new hours are. There's one other law, and that's a House bill that is still waiting for approval. Susanna's going to speak about this in her section on vaccines, and that places limits on employers mandating the COVID vaccine. It hasn't taken effect yet. We're expecting that it will, and it's just, you have to provide exemptions for religious and medical reasons, and you have to allow for natural immunity. That's really the only big things. Again, if you have remote workers, even a single remote worker in another state can trigger that state's laws. So you want to check the laws in the states where your remote workers are, as well as local ordinances, because there are some cities, New York City, Chicago, and you'd be surprised, even smaller cities that have adopted ordinances where your employees are physically located and you have to comply with them. So you just need to check those things out, and they can vary greatly by state. Indiana is a much different state from an employment perspective than Illinois or California. California just adopted a mandatory COVID leave that applies. And Chicago, same thing. There's paid sick leave that's different than what you're used to dealing with in Indiana, because we don't have that. The other thing is to don't make the mistake of having we say one-size-fits-all handbook. You can have generally, especially if you have remote workers or facilities in other states, you can have your general handbook, and then you can have state supplements at the end of it. That's how we usually deal with it, and it's easier to update and keep up to date with the changes. So you have the supplements in the back. And also, when you're looking at your employee handbook, you also want to look at, some policies, may be applicable to your exempt but not your non-exempt. So you need to read it with that in mind as well. Is that a policy, for your management, for everyone? Because certain things don't work, for certain types of employees. One of the things you also want to make sure that you have a statement in your handbook that explains the purpose of the handbook, and the handbook is giving the employees the general, overview of the company's policies, but it's a guide, it's an informational tool, and it's not designed to account for every single thing that happens in the workplace. And so you want employees to understand that this isn't, it doesn't encompass or anticipate everything, and that the company, importantly, has the right to modify and change the policies at any time in its discretion. And you want to notify employees if you do make changes to your policies, your handbook, and they need to be responsible for reviewing those things. And that's something that you should make sure you put in your handbook, and you also put in your acknowledgement of receipt of handbook that you should have employees sign. we talked about this a little bit earlier, that one of the, you want to make your employee handbook usable and readable. And so you want to use language that's clear and concise. Don't use legalese. Read it from the employee's perspective. Use plain language, common sense rules, and allow flexibility. Don't be rigid in the language that you're using. You can have the best handbook in the world, but if you don't have your employees acknowledge the fact that they got a copy of it and they read it and they agreed to follow the policies, it won't do you any good when you're defending a claim that they've brought. And it's not just in defending the claim, but that really, the acknowledgement part is the purpose of that, but you want to make sure that you have that signed acknowledgement, and that's something that you should keep in their personnel file. And in your acknowledgement form, it shouldn't just be, here, I got the handbook and I agree, I read it. Use that as the opportunity to also make sure that they understand the purpose of the handbook, that that's the current version, that the old versions are no longer good. They understand that you have a right to change those policies. Reiterate their employment at will if they're not a contract employee. Reiterate that. Also use that as the opportunity to remind them that the company's property is the company's property, and the company has the right to search any property, including their personal property on the premises, and that the company's computer systems and information systems are the company's, and they should not have an expectation of privacy in that. This is your chance to get them to sign off along with the handbook that they understand all those things. And then obviously you have them sign it and date it, put it in it, and if you redo your handbook, update and get a new acknowledgement form. Very important, and keep those in their files. So some of the important policies that you obviously want to have in your handbook are non-discrimination policies, and that includes your EEO statement that the company provides equal opportunities, regardless of any protected characteristic, to all employees and applicants. So you should have a separate EEO statement in your handbook. You also want to have discrimination and harassment policies. No discrimination, real or perceived, because both are illegal, race, color, religion, and sexual orientation, and importantly, always add, and any other legally protected characteristic, because in some states recognize categories that Indiana might not, so just throw in the catch-all. You should have a separate sex harassment policy, just because those policies, generally are a little bit more detailed. So in addition to just no discrimination on any protected basis, have a separate sexual harassment policy, and also a disability accommodations policy. So ADA is applicable to most businesses, so you want to have a policy the company provides reasonable accommodations. And as I talked about earlier, pregnancy accommodation, especially important now, that Indiana has adopted the law, have that policy. And you should also consider equal pay policies in some states. Those claims are on the rise, and we are recommending, and in some states you need to have them, like Illinois, we're recommending that you put those in your policy. Equal pay for equal work. So the EEO policy, again, just a sample of just a model EEO policy. Again, the important part, you're not discriminating against any aspect of employment, recruiting, hiring, promotions, regardless of, and insert your protected characteristics and add the catch-all. And managers need to understand everybody is responsible for complying with that policy, so everybody should be cooperating and has an obligation to help the company maintain that policy. One of the mistakes we see is failing to regularly update your handbook so that you keep up with all the changes in the law, and I know all the HR people and understand how often that happens. So again, this is just an example of, I mean, protected characteristics vary by state, so you want to make sure you have that catch-all. And again, I'll understand that perceived, in addition to actual, status is also unlawful. So if you perceive somebody in a certain protected characteristic and you discriminate against them, that's unlawful as well. It's actual or perceived. Harassment, in your harassment policies, some of the mistakes and, you know, that we see are if you're overly detailed, or on the opposite, you don't give any description. It really is one of those situations where you kind of do a happy medium, where you want, and we give you a model example, so that it's verbal, written, or physical conduct, where, and we give some examples of, you know, stereotypes and pictures, gestures, slurs, but anything that demeans or shows hostility towards or dislike towards a particular employee or group. And then you give some examples. But if you give too detailed a list and then something happens and it's not on that detailed list, they'll be like, well, it wasn't in those examples. You know, so it's one, again, you find that happy medium. Another mistake we'll see with some that's not included in some policies and some employers don't understand is that the harassment, and employees don't understand, it can come from many sources. Typically, a lot of people think of it as a supervisor and a subordinate, but it can be the opposite way. It can be the subordinate to the supervisor. It can be any employee towards another employee. But it can also be non-employees. So it can be a customer or a vendor or an independent contractor that you have towards one of your employees. Obviously, your ability to control that outsider person's conduct is somewhat limited, but there still are things, it still should be contemplated in your policy, and you should still take steps to protect that employee if it happens. It can also be employees towards your applicants, and it can be your employees towards non-employees. So their conduct with a vendor or a supplier or somebody at a business meeting.
Yeah. Did David leave?
He did.
So since David's not here, I'll say it can also be patients, the staff, and so for the healthcare providers here, we've certainly dealt with that.
Okay.
In work situations.
And so for those people online that might not have heard that, one of our healthcare partners pointed out that it can also be patients towards the doctor or the nurse.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly true in long-term care where the residents and the employees are together day in and day out, and they know the ins and outs with those folks, yeah.
So you just, in the policy, you make sure that those things are addressed in your policy, and that when you do your training, and that's a good idea to do harassment training once a year, and in some states, like Illinois, it's mandatory. Those are all things that should be as part of your harassment training with your employees. The other big thing is that the harassment can occur outside the workplace. Some people think that, oh, if it didn't happen in the office, the employer can't be responsible for it, and that's not true. So business trips, conferences, social events that, you know, the company is participating in or sponsoring. So again, your managers, your employees need to understand that those harassment policies apply anytime, you know, they're doing business, you know, for your company. Your disability policy, your ADA policy, the one mistake sometimes we see in policies is that it doesn't have limits. There are some limits on accommodations, you know, so if it's a direct, if the employee poses a direct threat to the health or safety of themselves or others, and you can't eliminate that by a reasonable accommodation, you don't have to employ them. So you want to make sure that that's covered in your ADA policy. And again, pregnancy accommodation, as I referenced earlier, Indiana passed that law, so you want to update your employee handbook to include that. And just generally, that you comply with all federal, state, laws that, with respect to pregnancy. And that so under the law, you have a duty to reasonably accommodate, and you won't require the employee who's pregnant to accept an accommodation if they don't want one. So you have an employee who's pregnant, don't assume that she needs an accommodation, so, and don't force them to take leave. Oh, we'll just stay home, for the next couple months, and then, don't force them to take leave when there are other reasonable accommodations that they might need. Another mistake is to not have appropriate complaint procedures in your handbook. So, with respect to, harassment and discrimination, you want to make sure you have a good complaint process, so employees know where to go if they have a problem. Who should they report it to? And it shouldn't just be one person. There should be an alternative. And, a lot of companies are also using compliance hotlines in addition, or as an alternative, so that the company can promptly investigate. And it's not just the person who was harassed, but the people that witness it. Employees should understand that if you witness harassment or discriminatory conduct, that they need to make the company aware of it, and they have obligation to do that so that the company can take prompt corrective remedial action if it turns out that there was substance to the complaint. And you want to ensure that the complaints are going to be investigated promptly and thoroughly, and there's nothing wrong with saying, but the complaints have to be honest and truthful. And you want to put in your policy too that false accusations, if they were intentionally and maliciously made, those aren't protected, and a person who does that is subject to discipline. So you put that in there as well. And importantly, no retaliation. So anybody that makes a complaint, they're not going to have any adverse consequences. You want to encourage people to come forward and let you know of problems so that you can fix them. So again, one of the mistakes is having ineffective complaint and reporting mechanisms. You don't want to be, I said, don't be too rigid. The example I give is if you had a policy that said you have to make your complaint in writing. You can say should, but don't say have to. Don't demand too much information, don't not thoroughly investigate just because maybe the first witness, doesn't cooperate, or you don't get information from the first person. Don't stop. Do a thorough investigation and document your document. And don't be too specific or too general about who to report to. Have a very clear alternatives for the employee. And we just included some model language for you for the complaint process.
I think another thing that's really important when it comes to complaint procedures that's kind of outside the topic of handbooks is making sure that your managers all have a clear understanding of what their obligation is when they receive a complaint, so that you don't have someone at this level getting the complaint and then saying, oh, well, that's not that big a deal, and not elevating it, not getting HR involved, and then the company is on notice, but the company's not taking prompt remedial action, and that's a problem when you have a lawsuit.
It's true.
Big problem.
And that's why a lot of companies will do separate training for their managers on how to handle complaints. So you can have training for everyone on just harassment and just, in general, but managers have some separate, obligations, and sometimes, it's effective to have training so, to Suzanne's point, they understand what they're supposed to do with. And one of the things they're not supposed to do is retaliate. So, because retaliation is illegal, so you have to address that in your policies. You should have a statement in your harassment and discrimination policies that lets employees know that if they come forward with a complaint or they participate in an investigation, that they're protected. That, and importantly, managers, supervisors have to understand this, that you cannot take negative action against an employee who's reported a matter discrimination or harassment. I recommend, I mean, so you have a no retaliation statement in your policy, but also just a separate standalone no retaliation policy that applies to any time that an employee raises a concern or brings, something to the company's attention in good faith, that they're not going to, that they're protected. This recommend having an open door policy. It goes along with the no retaliation, where so that your employees feel welcome to come forward with any concerns. So have an open door policy that encourages the employees to let you know if they have questions or concerns. But the open door policy, one of the things you want to put also in there is that doesn't apply to complaints about harassment. You still want to have any complaints like that reported under your harassment and discrimination policy. But separate and apart from that, just general workplace concerns and questions, have an open door, policy. And then this also goes to helping prevent wage and hour issues or not paying overtime, where you have clear policies about what your overtime expectations are, that you can't work overtime without authorization, that you can't fill out somebody else's time cards, don't falsify your pay records, review your pay statements, and if there are any mistakes, you want them to report things, and those things should be in your policies so that they understand what the expectations are, and this protects you from liability. So you want to make sure all those policies have those internal procedures in there so that they can bring those issues to your attention and you can investigate them, and if they're valid, you can correct them. And then routinely auditing your position classifications, and what we mean by that is your exempt and non-exempt. Review your job descriptions, make sure that they're updated, that they accurately state what the essential job duties are, and are they classified correctly? Are they truly exempt, or are they non-exempt? That's a big issue. Defending it against those claims are very costly. So you should regularly, at least once a year, make sure your job descriptions are up to date and your employees are properly classified. Don't guarantee confidentiality. Even though when you do your investigations of matters, you're maintaining as much confidentiality as you can't guarantee it. And there are some, you're gonna have to interview witnesses and talk to people, so you can't say strict confidentiality, because it's not. Let them know it's going to be investigated and that you're going to do, maintain it as confidentially as you can, but some things are going to, have to be discussed. I went the wrong way. Some basic employment policies, just some, mistakes. If you're too rigid, if you say an employee who does X will be terminated, or you guarantee that certain progressive discipline, if you have a progressive discipline policy, if you do this, you will get a written reprimand. Be flexible with your policies. Because if you don't follow it in that instance, they're going to point back to that policy and say you didn't follow your policy. If you're going to have a progressive discipline policy, it's fine, but just say these are steps that may be taken, and you might skip from the first to the last depending on the circumstances, so that your hands aren't bound, and that you have that flexibility. So in that regard, you should have somewhere in your handbook a list of what's considered inappropriate conduct. I mean, even though you think that people should know it, you need to have it in your handbook, So you have a list of, here are different types of things that may lead to discipline, but always make sure you have the catch-all that says that that's a non-exhaustive list, and there may be other things that may, lead to discipline. Another basic but important employment policy is for those companies that aren't union to have a statement in their handbook about being union-free and why the company isn't union. Some employers think, I can't say that. Yes, you can. You can tell them why you feel like unions are not in their best interests, and that they're encouraged to come forward with their concerns. And again, having that open door policy. And and that you are providing, you're striving to provide good working conditions and competitive wages, and also on that end have a non-solicitation policy, because that'll be one way. If union activity is on the rise, by the way, and even in sectors that not normally didn't have that activity, and I don't know if it's related to the pandemic in the last 2 years, but it's very active in the long-term care industry right now. So, some banks are seeing it. So these are important policies to have, because the non-solicitation can keep you from allowing distribution of literature in your facilities. So it's a policy that just says, non-employees can't distribute literature on our company premises. And then in terms of employees, there are some limitations. You can tell employees they can't distribute literature during working time, but you can't tell them not to do it during their non-working time in break work areas or non-work areas. So have a non-solicitation policy, but make sure that the policy is legal. And I think Suzanne is now going to come talk about some of the NLRB issues.
Yeah, thank you. Great, thanks. We're going to move through a few more slides here, and then there are going to be more slides in your that you'll get when you get the slides than we're going to go through today. We just have too much material. And Susanna's going to talk about vaccine mandates at the end, so we want to leave enough time for her. So the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, those of you who have not had experience working with a unionized workforce are probably less familiar with the National Labor Relations Board. Its job, as a federal government agency, job is to enforce the National Labor Relations Act, which certainly does, to some extent, govern the relationship between management and unions, but its authority goes beyond that. And the National Labor Relations Board has oversight responsibility to an extent over all employees, and that comes from Section 7, which was referenced in the last slide and will be referenced in some future ones. But Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act says essentially that employees have the right to engage in protected concerted activities. That means that an employee can go to their coworker and say, hey, I got a raise and it was only 1.5%, and I think that's really crummy. What was your raise? Oh, you got 5%? Well, that is unfair, right? They have the right to do that. They have the right to know what other employees are getting paid. They have the right to know what benefits are being offered to other employees, and they have the right to talk about those things. And that's true whether the employer is union organized or not. So when you're writing your employee handbooks and creating your employee policies, you have to be careful that you don't overstep some of those things intentionally or unintentionally. I think when we see it most often is unintentionally. I wasn't intending my policy to stifle that ability of employees to talk and to discuss terms and conditions of employment, but the NLRB may view your policy that way. And what we see over time, this is a huge overcharacterization, but in general, the National Labor Relations Board tends to swing a bit more when there is a Republican administration versus a Democrat administration because of the way those board members are appointed. So more so, I think, than a lot of agencies, we see more of a swing as far as what they will enforce, what they view as a violation of the National Labor Relations Act, and how willing they are to get involved in these types of situations. So this slide tells us about some types of policies often found in employee handbooks, policies that can run you into trouble under the National Labor Relations Act and leave you defending your policies before the National Labor Relations Board. And we'll talk about some of those in a little bit more detail. So the National Labor Relations Board issues guidance, and every time there's a change in the administration, when the party in charge in Washington changes hands, we see a flurry of guidance. And what we saw under the Obama administration was a lot of guidance. We're going to, in general, again, I'm over characterizing, but we're going to we're going to enforce our ability to push down on employers' policies that we feel are overreaching. We switch to a Republican administration and they take a lot of that out and they allow the employers to have more leeway. Democrat comes back in and says, wait a minute, I think this is overreaching, I think this is overreaching. So that's kind of what we're seeing here. That guidance does not have the force of law, but it gives us good insight as to what the National Labor Relations Board is thinking, what their enforcement priorities are. And we've seen a lot of stuff recently about what the areas that they're going to be looking at. And most of it comes out of either the right of employees to engage in protected concerted activity and or the right of employees to unionize and attempt to unionize the workforce of the employer where they're working. And that's something that I think those of us in Indiana are not as used to, with the exception of certain industries. In other states, unions are a lot more powerful, but because employees, to some extent, have the upper hand right now, which hasn't been the case in recent history, we're seeing a lot more of a push toward unionization. So it's something that all employers need to be cognitive of and thinking of, particularly as they're drafting their policies. So we talked about protected concerted activities. Employers can protect their own copyrights, logos. They can protect their own confidential information. If you're in healthcare, you can certainly protect patient information. If you're in banking, you certainly can protect account holders' information. You can prohibit employees in how they interact with other employees. You can prevent harassment. You can prevent stalking. You can generally prevent meanness, right? But what you can't do is stop employees from, as we discussed earlier, talking about terms and conditions of employment. And that might be wages, that might be benefits, that might be this supervisor that everybody thinks is a jerk, right? It might be talking about pay, it might be talking about flexible work schedules, it could be talking about anything that is considered terms and conditions of employment. And you also can't prevent or prohibit or limit employees' ability to investigate unions' attempt to form or join a union. So while you can tell them your position on unions and you think that the fact that you think that your employment policies protect them better than a union could, you can't legally prevent them from attempting to unionize. And the NLRB often looks at policies, and if they feel that the policy overreaches to the extent that it would, even if not explicitly, prevent employees from engaging in protected concerted activity or attempting to form a union, if they think it would chill their belief that they could do that, then they may view that as overreaching. So it's something that you need to be careful of as you're drafting those policies.
And I would just point out too, one of the things we see is, I mean, this doesn't apply to just things that happen in the workplace. So something that an employee says at work. One of the areas that we see, the potential violations or problematic is social media. Employees posting things on social media that are negative about the company. A lot of times the initial reaction is just, demanding to take it down, disciplining, but you have to be really careful and evaluate the content of what's in those messages. I mean, it's one thing if the employee is just going on a tirade and, calling the supervisor names and it's not tied really to any term or condition of employment, but there's a fine line. And so just make sure that your managers know that any discipline for things like that should go to your HR so that your HR can evaluate it before there's any action taken, and that can save you an NLRB complaint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in those types of situations, particularly if it's inflammatory, you want to look at it, and then you want to take a step back, take a deep breath, figure out what's the best course of action, right? Because if it is inflammatory and if it makes you angry and your immediate response is, that guy's out of here, we're not putting up with that, right? It may come back to haunt you. You have to be careful and think it through, think what the implications are, think about what your options are, and then choose the best course of action after informing yourself and thinking about it with that context in mind. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about attendance policies. Probably one of the first thing that employees look at when they look at an employee handbook, right? They always want to know, how many days off do I have? What do I do if I have to call in? How does this work? So one of the things that we sometimes see that is definitely a problem, particularly when you have a no-fault attendance policy, is that employees are penalized for taking medical leave or other protected leave of absence, particularly FMLA, or perhaps an employee has a disability of some sort and they miss work periodically because of that. Maybe they have been approved for intermittent FMLA leave, but then you see it showing up either directly, they're being penalized for those absences, or, and this is more often, we see it showing up on the employee's performance evaluation. Well, their attendance is bad, but they're on intermittent FMLA leave, and then they file a claim under the FMLA and say, you've penalized me for my protected leave, and then you look at it and say, oh, well, I kind of think we have a problem here. So attendance issues and performance issues, you want to keep them separate, right? Certainly you can discipline employees for poor performance. Certainly you can discipline employees for poor attendance. What you can't do is penalize employees because of protected leaves, whether that's FMLA or accommodations under the ADA or other protected leaves. So we'll go through some of those other leaves in a minute. Emergency closure, something that we really didn't think about as much pre-pandemic, and over the last few years, we've been up and down. We might have had maybe a big snow now and then, but we haven't had the disruptions that we've had more recently. So things to think about in how you want to address that, and come up with a plan before you need it, right? Maybe you never have to implement it. That's great. But think about it beforehand so that do I have to, am I going to pay non-exempt folks. Exempt employees, if they work any portion of that week, you've got to pay them their full salary with certain exceptions that track the statute. But those are things that you want to think about ahead of time and including your policy. More on the FMLA. The FMLA, if you are a covered employer, meaning you have, you're covered by the statute, even if some of your employees may not be eligible because of where they work, but you still have to have an FMLA policy in your handbook. It's written into the statute. It's required to be included, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's one of the very few statutes that you actually have a legal obligation to include it in your handbook. So you definitely want to have that one. You want to have it well written. You want it to both track the statute, but also help employees to understand what it means and how they're eligible. Way back early in my career, I dealt with a case where an employer actually wasn't covered by the FMLA, but they put it in their handbook because they had gotten a sample handbook from somewhere and didn't realize that it wasn't covered. An employee applied for leave, took the leave, and then somewhere along the line they decided, oh, well, we're not even covered. We don't have to bring him back. He sued and ended up winning on a contract argument because he had relied on their policy even though they didn't have a legal obligation to put it in there. So you don't want it in there if it doesn't apply. If it does apply, you're obligated to have it in there. Right. Medical leaves of absence. There's no, at least in Indiana, there's no general rule outside the FMLA that you must have a medical leave of absence policy, but we have to accommodate under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that can, in certain circumstances, include time away from work, depending on the situation. So you want to be careful that you're not creating a contractual right that you don't intend to create when you draft your employee handbook. But you also want to be sure that you are allowing for the accommodation process under the ADA. And also that you're not discriminating against someone with a disability by not allowing them to take leave when you're allowing leave to be taken for non-medical reasons. So if you allow employees to take a month off for, I don't know, something non-medical, but then you don't allow the person who needs time off for medical reasons, then you could run into a problem under the Americans with Disabilities Act, depending on the particular circumstances. All right. Military leave, you know, you certainly have to comply. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these slides because we are kind of getting a little bit low on time. We want to leave some time for our discussion about vaccines. But military leave is certainly something that you should have on your radar. In my experience, it's not always included in employee handbooks. There's not a particular obligation to include it, but it is important that you are aware of when those rights trigger, whether it is USERRA, which is the federal law that prohibits discrimination based on military service, and also allows certain employees to take time off for military obligations, as well as the state laws. And Indiana has a state military family leave law. USERRA, in the last slide, protects the military, the employee who is, the employee themselves is a member of the military or is called up to military service or is previously a member of the military. The Indiana Military Family Leave Act allows certain employees to take time off if a family member is being deployed. So it's time to spend time with that person before they leave. It's time off to get things organized. Maybe the person who's being deployed was responsible for childcare and they have to change that all up, or whatever the circumstances are. They want to go create a will. They want to do whatever it is that the family feels that they need time to do before they before that person deploys. Jury and witness duty, all of these types of things in Indiana at least do not have to be paid. But I think that the real lesson for all of these slides is to think about these things beforehand. Are you going to provide paid leave? Are you going to allow the leave but it's unpaid? How are you going to do that? I've seen policies even where, you know, somebody does jury duty, and what do? They pay you like, I don't know, what's like, yeah, like $15 a day or something. I mean, some nominal amount. And some employers really would say, well, we'll pay you for 3 days, but we're going to subtract that amount. And yeah, you just need to decide. Do you want to deal with that headache? Do you just want to make it unpaid? You want to encourage people, obviously, to do their civic duty, right? If they have a subpoena, you can't really prevent them from doing that, but you can put policies in place. You can think through how you want to do it beforehand. Certainly the time will be excused, but you want to think ahead of time about how, whether they're going to be paid, whether they're not going to be paid, what the process is going to be, what the notice requirements are to let their supervisor know so that the supervisor can be sure that the shift is covered, those types of things. Okay. All right, vacation and personal days. How do you want to set that up? What works for your organization? Does it make sense to have a separate vacation policy, a separate personal day policy, a sick leave policy, that kind of thing? Or do you want to put it all into one bucket? And what are the implications of that? If you put it all into one bucket, then what does that mean when an employee leaves and they haven't used all of that time? Did you properly prorate things so that you don't have to pay out the whole year of vacation if the employee leaves on February 15th, right? So those are all things that you want to think about. In Indiana specifically, it really what your obligations are with unused PTO depend on how you've written the policy. So if you've clearly written it, and you can show that you've communicated that to the employee, again, it goes back to the acknowledgement from the handbook. If you have that policy in the handbook and you have to be able to show that the employee knew about it, then you may not always have to pay out unused vacation. In other states, that may be different. So you need to be sure that you're complying with that. Other things to think about if you're going to go with a singular PTO policy versus breaking it out for sick leave or personal leave or vacation is when does that clock start? Is it based on anniversary date, or are you going to have everybody get so much on January 1? Can you use it before it's accrued? How does that work? What do you pay out at the end? Are there exceptions to when you'll pay out unused vacation? Those types of things. As well as what is the minimum amount of time that an employee can take? Are you going to say you can take this in 1 hour increments? Or are you going to say you can only take this in half-day increments? If you use a smaller increment, then you're going to have to carry that over to FMLA, because the FMLA regulations say you can take it in the smallest. It has to be, I think there's like a minimum of the amount, it has to be a small increment. But if you allow other types of leave in even smaller increments, then you have to do the same for FMLA. Sick leave, we're seeing more and more jurisdictions requiring paid sick leave, not just states, but also, as Deb mentioned, cities, even counties. I know there are a few counties in the East Coast that have implemented paid sick leave policies. So it's important if you have employees in those jurisdictions, particularly if you just have one or two, it may very well trigger those policies, and they may be different than your PTO policies. Even if you have a pretty generous PTO policy, sometimes it's not the same. So you need to be sure that you're cognizant of that, that you're thinking about it. and that you look at whether some of those requirements include requirements to notify the employee of the policy. So it's important to keep all of those things in mind when you're talking about sick leave. And the same with holidays. Just think through things before they become a problem. Are you going to require say it's an hourly employee, are you going to require them to work the shift prior to the holiday in order to get paid, or are you not going to? Some employers have pretty complicated policies about holidays, frankly, and others just say, hey, these are the days that we're closed and these are the days that are paid holidays. How do you deal with those holidays that fall on different days of the week? How are you going to pay those? How do you deal with part-time employees as far as holiday pay and so forth? Right. Job abandonment, certainly one of the most critical policies, I would argue, in your employee handbook, ranks right up there with having a good attendance policy, is to make sure that you address what happens if somebody just is a no call, no show. How long do you let that go, so you don't have them hanging out there in limbo? All right. So we have a lot of slides in here about compensation policies. They are certainly very important. We've talked about this at various points throughout the presentation today. They're all in the slides. But I think we are running out of time to go through them. Kevin's telling me we've got 5 minutes if we're going to leave Susanna with just 15 to do the vaccine. So overtime, obviously for all the reasons that we discussed earlier, very important to have a clear overtime policy. You don't want employees picking and choosing when they are going to work overtime, and then all of a sudden, their hours they've worked 70 hours for the week or some crazy thing like that when you weren't expecting that. So I think this is even more important when you have remote employees, when you have employees working from home, when you have employees working flexible schedules, particularly when you have hourly employees working in those types of roles. So set the expectation, make it clear, follow your policy, actually follow what's written, which I think is when we talked earlier about make a clear policy and consistently implement that policy, consistently follow through. One of the worst things that you can do is have a policy and then have a practice that doesn't follow the policy, right? So it's extremely important that the policies are well written, that you think it through beforehand, that you make sure that they get authorization for overtime before they work it and so forth. Yeah.
Can you briefly explain salaried non-exempt?
Salaried non-exempt? So sure, yeah. So under the Fair Labor Standards Act, so an employee is either exempt from overtime requirements or they are non-exempt. So if they are exempt, you can pay them a set salary for all hours they work, whether they work 30 hours that week or 60 hours that week. If they are non-exempt, then you have to pay them for every hour that they work, and you have to pay them time and a half or 1.5 times their hourly rate for any hours worked over 40. A salaried non-exempt, that was the question, right? What is a salaried non-exempt employee? It's basically an employee that is entitled to overtime, but is paid a set salary for an agreed upon number of hours, probably 40, right? But it doesn't have to be 40. So let's say an employee is paid a salary for 40 hours a week, but they are not exempt. Either their job duties don't meet the exemption requirements, or maybe they're not paid at the minimum amount that would trigger that exemption. Then if they work more hours, then you have to figure out what was their hourly rate and pay them the overtime difference. There are different ways that the Fair Labor Standards Act and certain state laws allow that to happen. Sometimes you can have an even more complicated process that's called the, what is it, the flexible, it's you're paid this salary for regardless, which is the base pay, kind of
The fluctuating work week?
the fluctuating work week, right, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So that one gets a little more complicated. I think it has to be in writing. But just generally, salary non-exempt is someone who's paid a salary, but they're still entitled to overtime. Yeah. Yeah, right. Right. And that's true for all non-exempt employees. That you have to track the hours that they actually work.
Even if they're salaried and they're working 40 hours, they still have to track those hours.
You're required to track the hours that they work, because if for some reason, for whatever reason, for any reason, they were to work more than 40 hours a week, even if it's unauthorized, you're legally obligated to pay them the time and a half for the hours over 40. All right? Yeah.
Well, I was just going to emphasize, because I had this conversation with a client last week, but the thing that makes someone exempt or non-exempt is not the way you pay them, it's the type of job they do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes people are like, oh, well, I'm just going to make them salary. It's like, well, no, that's not really how it works.
Right. Same is true of independent contractors. Just because you call them an independent contractor doesn't make them so. Just because you call them exempt or just because you call them salary doesn't make it so. There's a legal requirement that has to be met in each one of those situations. So we have a lot more slides. You'll have all of that information. I'm going to turn it over to Susanna, just because of our time constraints here, and I think we're all more interested in what's going on with the vaccine mandates than we are with whatever other handbook slides we had in there.
It's not.
It's not over yet?
No.
I don't know.
It's not over yet.
Susanna's going to tell us.
Take it
So,
away.
yeah, you have to stick around for the end.
Sorry, I know. I get to clean up with the topic everyone is so sick of hearing about. I gotta say, I'm getting to the point where I'm like, oh my gosh, you gotta be kidding me. Man, look at all these slides here.
I know. Yeah, we started with one adjustment.
Okay, all right. You want? Oh, well, I'm gonna have to do. Yeah, I can't do both. You
I'm
mind?
here
Okay.
for you.
I might call on you. Okay. Anyway, I gotta do this fast. Okay, so vaccine mandates. Who cares? Who would have thought? Who would have thought? So the only vaccine mandate in Indiana that is left standing after all the everything going all over the place is the CMS vaccine mandate for healthcare workers. So that's the only one in Indiana that is still standing. Other states, are Illinois, all those other crazy places have all kinds of rules in place, but we're in Indiana, so we just got that one. Now, what is still percolating in Indiana, which started as an anti-vaccine mandate, House Bill 1001, which is now changed from its original. As it stands now, it wouldn't allow employers, and this is the way it's phrased, it's a weird way to phrase it, but it would not allow employers to impose a mandate unless certain requirements were met. So in other words, it would allow employers to impose a mandate if they do certain things. I'm going to describe those things in a minute. So it passed out of the House on January 18th, passed out of Senate Committee February 16th, and being the good person that I am, I checked the status this morning, and yesterday the House dissented, what's the phrase? Dissented from the Senate amendments, and so now it's in conference committee. Which is when, and I used to have to follow the legislative, so that's when the House and the Senate have to get together, they appoint their conferees, and they figure out what in the world they're going to do with this bill. So who knows? So stay tuned. We'll know when session is over. So that's that. But it needs to, so it needs approval by both houses and to be signed by the governor. So what, if House Bill 1001 proceeded as it was amended in the Senate, so, who knows? Because I went through it this morning. This looks to be the language as it stands now. But anyway, basically it's that if an employer, so this would be any employer, and it's not a requirement, so this is imposing the rules for if an employer decides to mandate the COVID vaccine for its workforce, this is what it would have to include. You would have to allow exemptions. So this is so if you've been following, the news about the Supreme Court cases and all that that's been going on, this is gonna sound very familiar, that you have to allow exemptions for medical reasons or religious reasons. The employee has, you know, and if the employee would be exempt if they've agreed to, so regardless whether they've got an exemption, that they could have agreed to submit to testing in lieu of vaccination, or if they've got immunity from COVID-19 due to a prior infection. So it's a little bit different, but a little the same as what we've heard.
And just one thing, Susanna, in case anyone is not getting the baseline, there is no, with a little bit of exception that you can, but there is no mandate, but the employer can choose to mandate vaccines
Right.
if they want to do that.
Right.
This regulates that versus the
Right.
mandate that we talked about previously, they're all except for one holiday.
Right, and the thing is too, that if you're covered by the CMS vaccine mandate, you're still covered by that, and this doesn't, you wouldn't follow this anyway. Okay. So, and then the other thing is that an employer, so if you're an employer not covered by this vaccine mandate, and if this bill actually passes, and you decide to impose a mandate, that in terms of imposing a testing requirement, you could not require an employee to submit to testing more than twice a week. If the employee gets an exemption, because a lot of, you know, the standard thing is, okay, I've got an employee who's exempt, the way I'm going to monitor them is have them undergo testing, and this bill says you can't make them undergo testing more than twice a week. And then the exemptions, I'm not going to spend a lot of, well, because I don't have a lot of time, but I mean, it does lay out, you know, how they get the exemption for medical reasons. It does have to be signed by a licensed physician or a physician's assistant, which is a little different, or an advanced practice nurse who's actually examined the employee, so not a phone it in and, you know, can you write me a note? And then it does have to say, and this is kind of like the federal rule, that it does have to say that in the professional opinion of the practitioner, that immunization is medically contraindicated, excuse me. And then the religious reasons, you know, this is, again, if you've been following any of the conversations we've been having about this, you know, it's how you can do sincerely held religious belief. So that's kind of the basic thing. If it's immunity, it's got to be, they've got to provide the result of a lab test. And they're very specific lab tests. So the CMS, so that's the Indiana bill. And again, I know that was really fast. You'll get the slides, and who knows? I mean, who knows what's going to happen? Things go to conference committee, and they never come out. And I know I'm going to do this briefly too, but just so everyone knows, so the CMS rule for healthcare workers, that was where on January 13th, Supreme Court ruled that yes, it can be enforced. In 24 states where it had been enjoined, and that had included Indiana, so effective January 13th, that rule then ended up being able to be enforced in Indiana. January 14th is when the CMS, you know, turned around and said, okay, this is what you got to do. So February 15th, and I'm saying this because those of you in healthcare and who are covered by this, if you weren't aware of this, now's when you should feel a little bit of a gut check. And those of you who are involved in healthcare, you could just feel bad for those people in healthcare that got to deal with this. So February 15th was when the policies had to be kind of implemented and developed, and people had to have started receiving their vaccines February 15th. And what that meant is if it was somebody getting the J&J vaccine, they had to have that shot by January 15th. That was something that surprised people a little bit. Then March 15th, which is coming up, so that hasn't happened yet, but March 15th, that everyone has to be 100% vaccinated. 100% of staff have to have gotten both doses by March 15th or been granted an exemption. And this isn't something that's going to be enforced by CMS. And those of you not in healthcare may wonder, you know, so what's the big deal? What's at stake here is this is now a requirement of participation in the Medicare program. So if the healthcares are found not to be in compliance, they could not be paid for their claims that they submit. So it's money. It's money. It's money. It's money. It's also patient safety and all that stuff too. If you are not 100% compliant, so they're going to start enforcement. They're giving, so March 15th is that, I shouldn't use drop dead date given what we're talking about, is the date. Sorry, it's, you know, I had the key lime pie and I've got too much sugar in my system. So March 15th was the, you know, date to have people have their shots. April 14th is when CMS, where the surveyors might start coming around knocking on people's doors to see if you're compliant. They actually started monitoring for compliance supposedly on February 15th, but April 14th is when they're going to supposedly get more serious about it. The thing, and I'm not going to cover all the requirements of the rule because I'm also, time, and a lot of you don't really care that much. But the one thing is that it is the thing about the CMS rule that has surprised some people is that it applies to, yes, the employees of the facility that's covered by, the rule, which is not all health. It's certain. It's a long list of healthcare entities. But it's also suppliers to those facilities. So if you are, like an example came up, you work for a vending machine company, operate a vending machine company, and you have folks going in to a long-term care facility that participates in Medicare to restock the vending machines that folks use. If that person is going into that facility on a regular basis, they need to comply with a vaccine requirement. Same would be true for the bottled water deliverer or the cleaning company, the linen company. And it's not, but the thing to think about, if Susie Smith goes in today, and I'm very creative with my names here, I would find out, Joe Schmo goes in next week, and then if it's someone different every week, then those people, because it's 52 different people during the course of the year, they wouldn't have to be vaccinated. But if Susie Smith is going in a couple times, 3 times a year even, she does have to be vaccinated. So that's something to think about too, which makes it very complicated for those outside vendors, but that's the way it works. And so that's why, again, all of you who aren't in healthcare should think, oh my gosh, I feel so sorry for you people if you haven't felt that way already.
And Susanna, it's the healthcare entity's job to ensure those people are vaccinated, is that right?
Yeah, because it's their, but I would say, it is their obligation they've got to verify that because it's their funding on the line. But I would say those suppliers should want to be cooperative because surely they don't want to lose the business from that healthcare entity. But I guess that's a business decision. So there's a really long list of the covered entities. It's not all of them. And I talked about the vendor issue because I wanted to talk about that. It does not apply to people who are working remotely. If you never set foot on site or if you're only there once a year, the example CMS gave was so helpful was the annual elevator inspection. So that we know that person doesn't have to be vaccinated. And then there's this wide gap in between. Booster doses aren't necessarily required. If someone's not and it doesn't have the exemption, then they've got to, that you have to have additional protocols. Documentation. I think I decided this was where I was going to. Wow, I did that quickly. The exemptions, under the CMS rule, they have to provide exemptions over religious beliefs or the medical reasons. The medical reasons, though, have to be limited to the contraindications of COVID-19, and that would, again, also apply to the vendors who are sending people on site. So it's not just that I'm allergic to whatever is the basis of this vaccine. It's, these are the specific, I think there's 6 identified contraindications on the CDC website. And those are the ones that have to be the reason. And it has to be someone who's actually qualified from a professional who's qualified to make the decision that the person has the contraindications. And this is the summary. So the reasonable accommodations, again, this is appropriate, even something to think about. If you're thinking about the Indiana bill, if it passes, reasonable accommodations for folks who can't be vaccinated or granted exemptions, and that's where you get into the remote telework requirement. It's everything people have been dealing with, right? Additional PPE, transferring them to a different, less exposed position, giving them leave maybe, if that's appropriate, or of course the testing requirement. Okay, that was it. All right, I think we now covered all of our materials, and we probably should now for 2 minutes allow questions. 4 minutes, questions about anything you've heard today. So whirlwind, do you want us to repeat the whole, we can go back to the whole slide?
I'd offer the folks listening, folks in the room, if you need any sort of sample language policy, we've got a whole, the whole list of the policies that you see on the materials when they're mailed out. If there's anything you need, we've got it in stock. So, I wouldn't just run and implement it, but it gives you a pretty good start, a running start with policies and forms going forward. So please reach out to, relationship attorney that you have at Smith Amundsen, and we'll make sure we get you that. We can get it to you in Word. So you don't even have, it's nice to convert and you can modify pretty easily. Anything else, Deb?
With whatever questions you think of
Yeah.
after.
Yeah, let us know.
About this stuff or,
Yeah, send them to Overhaul. Well, thank you. I think we're done. I mean, unless you want me to dance? Yeah. You don't want me to dance. I don't dance.